and welcome to the Snickerdoodle Knits YouTube channel. I am Jessica, the knitter and designer behind Snickerdoodle Knits. In this video, we are going to talk about how to perform the knit stitch. This is typically the first stitch you learn how to work in your knitting patterns. Before you can begin to work your knit stitch, however, you must have your stitches casted on to begin with. If you are unfamiliar with how to cast on, the cast on tutorial link is linked below. If you are familiar with how to cast on, let's get going. Now that you have cast on the stitches necessary for your pattern, you can begin to work the knit stitches. You will pick up the needle that has your cast on in your left hand. You will then pick up your second knitting needle in your right hand. To begin, you typically want to tension your working yarn in your hand such that it's easy to keep the yarn flowing in the same tension. Another important factor before you start working your stitches is how loose or tight your cast-on stitches on the needle are. You want them to be tight enough that they stay securely on your knitting needle, but you don't want them so tight that it is difficult to work the knitting stitches. It is very typical for a beginner knitter to cast on and work their stitches tightly, making it very complicated and difficult to work their stitches. If you're wanting to loosen your stitches, you can just move the stitches slightly on the knitting needle to loosen them up a little bit. Now let's get started. The way that I wrap my yarn around my fingers to keep the yarn tensioned is I just bring the working yarn around my index finger, and then I hold the yarn with my middle finger. Now let's pick up our second knitting needle. To start, you bring your right hand needle into the bottom of the first stitch. Then you wrap your working yarn over the top of that knitting needle and you pull the knitting needle through. Then you just slip your stitch off of the left knitting needle. You have completed your first knit stitch. Let's do that again. Bring your right needle into the bottom of the top stitch. Bring your yarn over the top of that knitting needle and bring the needle out. Now you just pull this stitch off of your left knitting needle. There, you've completed 2 knitting stitches. I will continue to work the remainder of the stitches as knit stitches for demonstration. There, we have completed our first row of knit stitches. Now to continue to work in the knit stitch pattern, we will take what was in our right hand and put it in our left hand, which is the working stitches. Then we will take the empty needle into our right hand, and we will work the knit stitches exactly the same way. We've completed 2 rows of knit stitches. Because we are working on straight knitting needles and working back and forth, this is called working flat. You will notice that when you are knitting every row, when you are working flat, every other row will have a ridge. Maybe you can see the ridge from our first row here, and then our second row of knit stitches seems to be indented more, and you can see a V shape that is formed by the knit stitches. This fabric that is created is called garter. This is a very common texture to create in knitting. To create garter, When working flat, you knit every row. If you are working in the round, you will knit one row and purl the next row and continue that pattern until you have completed your garter section. For demonstration, I'll continue this so you can see what garter stitch looks like after we've completed a few rows. There, now we have a section of worked garter stitch. Remember, garter stitch is just knitting every row when you are knitting flat. You will see that it creates these ridges between flat sections that have a V shape. Garter stitch creates a very squishy and cozy fabric. It can also feel somewhat bulky because of how squishy it is. You will notice that you can pull the fabric quite a lot because of how squished up it is and how cozy this makes it. It's that simple. You now know how to perform both the knit stitch and garter stitch. You are well on your way to becoming an expert knitter. Congratulations and happy knitting! If you are interested in more knitting tutorials, you can visit Snickerdoodle Knits YouTube channel to learn more techniques for beginner knitters.